The night before Challenger launched, engineers told NASA not to fly. The evidence was already in the system. Damaged O-rings, cold weather warnings, memos, charts, and conversations. Then the burden of proof moved. Not because the physics changed, because the meeting changed what counted as enough evidence to stop the schedule. 73 seconds after liftoff, that translation became fire in the Florida sky. This is not a story about a failed part. It is a story about how an organization learned to live with risk until it could no longer tell warning from routine. To understand how that happened, start with the promise the shuttle system had to keep. Mercury, Gemini, Apollo. Each was built around singular missions, dedicated hardware, dedicated risk, dedicated public attention. The shuttle was designed to break that model. Reusable, frequent, routine. Less expedition, more airline. That was the pitch. And the pitch shaped everything. When you promise routine, you change what people expect. You change how budgets get approved, what counts as caution, and what counts as a delay. A scrub on Apollo was an engineering decision. A scrub on the shuttle, by the mid-1980s, was a schedule failure, a public embarrassment, a cost. NASA had committed to an aggressive launch cadence, not because the engineering demanded it, but because the economics and the politics did. The shuttle had to justify its existence through volume. That is the first thing to understand about Challenger. The system was built to make spaceflight feel normal. And normal is where the normalization of risk begins. But normal requires something specific. It requires tension to stay hidden. No one in this story woke up wanting a disaster. That needs to be clear, because the easy version turns people into villains, and villains let the audience off the hook. If the problem was one bad person, you fire them and move on. The problem was a system. 3 pressures were running at the same time. They were not aligned. First, technical uncertainty. The shuttle was enormously complex. Every flight surfaced new data, some of it unexpected. Engineers were constantly learning how the hardware actually behaved versus how it was designed to behave. That gap is normal in engineering. What matters is how the gap gets managed. Second, schedule pressure. NASA had promised a 2 flights a month rhythm and entered 1986 with 15 shuttle missions on the calendar. Delays cascaded. A scrub didn't just move one mission. It shifted everything downstream. Payloads had windows. Customers had contracts. Congress had expectations. Third, institutional reputation. NASA was not just an engineering organization. It was a symbol, national pride, Cold War competition, public trust, congressional funding. All of it rode on the perception that NASA could deliver. These 3 pressures coexisted inside every decision meeting. The question that shaped this disaster was simple. When they conflicted, which one yielded first? The answer repeatedly was uncertainty. Technical concerns were the easiest to reframe, qualify, defer. Schedule and reputation were harder to bend. So the system developed an informal rule. Keep flying, unless the evidence against flying is overwhelming. That is a very different standard from do not fly unless the evidence for safety is clear. And the place where that difference showed up most clearly was a single component. The shuttle used 2 solid rocket boosters for most of its thrust during the first 2 minutes of flight. Each booster wasn't built as a single piece. It was assembled from cylindrical segments, stacked and joined at the launch site. Where those segments met, there was a joint. Inside the joint, 2 rubber O-rings, a primary and a secondary, were supposed to seal the gap and keep superheated combustion gases from escaping. If both failed, there was nothing else. No backup, no abort. Hot gas would burn through the casing, reach the external fuel tank, and that would be the end. The O-rings had been showing signs of distress for years. Post-flight inspections found erosion on the primary seal. In some cases, gas had blown past it entirely and reached the secondary. Engineers documented it, measured it, reported it up the chain, and each time, because the mission succeeded, because the vehicle came home, the evidence was processed not as a warning that the design was failing, but as proof that the design was tolerating its failure. That distinction is the hinge of this entire story. A damaged component in a surviving system can be read two ways. 1. We were closer to failure than we should have been. Fix this before we fly again. 2. The system handled it. The margins held. Keep flying while we work on improvements. NASA chose the second reading. Repeatedly. Each successful landing with damaged O-rings made the next flight with damaged O-rings feel more acceptable. What had once been a serious anomaly became a known condition. What had been a known condition became, in the language of the program, an acceptable risk. But here is the part that matters most. The O-ring problem did not stay inside the engineering department. It moved, and every time it moved, it changed shape. Here is how a warning dies inside a large organization. Not through suppression, through translation. Step 1. An engineer sees something wrong. The data is specific. The language is direct. A memo says primary O-ring eroded to a depth of 0.053 inches. Soot found behind it, indicating blow-by. Secondary O-ring showed heat effects. The joint is not sealing as designed. Precise. Uncomfortable. Step 2. The observation becomes a discussion item. It enters a review meeting alongside dozens of other concerns, other anomalies, other systems, other components. Presented in summary format, context broadens, urgency flattens. It is no longer one engineer's alarm. It is a line 14 on a 40-item list. Step 3. The discussion becomes a judgment call. Someone has to decide, does this affect the next flight? And the answer depends entirely on the question you ask. Can we prove this will cause a failure? Almost always no. Proving a specific failure on a specific flight is extremely difficult. Can we prove it won't? Also no. But the first question is the one that gets asked, because it is the one that allows the schedule to continue. Step 4. The judgment becomes a schedule decision. The language shifts again. No longer about erosion depths or blow-by distances. Now it is about whether there is sufficient cause to delay. Delay has costs. Delay has consequences. Delay means someone calls someone else and explains why the timeline moved. The bar for delay is high. The bar for proceeding is low. Step 5. The schedule decision becomes institutional memory. The flight goes, the vehicle returns, and the precedent now exists. We flew with this condition and nothing happened. That precedent is more powerful than any memo because it is not an argument. It is a fact. We flew. We were fine. This chain, observation, discussion, judgment, schedule, precedent, ran multiple times before Challenger. Each cycle made the next one easier. Each safe return reinforced the belief that the concern was manageable. The engineers who raised it were not ignored. They were heard, and then overridden by a system that had learned to file their concerns under acceptable. The sociologist Diane Vaughan later named this the normalization of deviance, not a conspiracy, not negligence in the way people usually mean it, a slow structural process in which a deviation from design expectations gets absorbed into the operational norm. Not because anyone decided it was safe, but because the system kept functioning as if it were. That process ran for years. It ran right up to the night before the last launch, January 27th, 1986. Less than 24 hours before the scheduled launch, a teleconference between NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, Kennedy Space Center, and Morton Thiokol, the contractor that built the solid rocket boosters. The subject was temperature. Forecasts and engineering estimates pointed to launch conditions far colder than any previous shuttle flight. Overnight pad temperatures in the low 20s, with some discussions citing figures as low as 18 degrees. The Thiokol engineers were concerned. Their data showed a relationship between cold and O-ring damage. Colder temperatures meant less resilient rubber, slower seating, more blow-by. Their recommendation was clear. Do not fly below 53 degrees, the coldest prior O-ring experience base they believed they could defend. NASA pushed back. Not with counter-evidence, with counter-questions. The data was called inconclusive. The correlation was challenged as incomplete. And then came the question that restructured the conversation. Can you prove it is unsafe to fly? That question reversed the burden of proof. Instead of requiring evidence that launch was safe, it demanded evidence that failure was certain. That evidence did not exist, not in a form that could survive the scrutiny of a room that wanted to fly. Thiokol asked for a 5-minute offline caucus. It lasted 30 minutes. When they returned, their recommendation had changed. The new position. The data is inconclusive. We cannot prove it is unsafe. We recommend launch. The engineers were not overruled by data. They were overruled by a shift in the decision framework. Is it safe became, can you prove it isn't? And within that frame, their concerns could not meet the standard. One engineer later described it as watching a decision he knew was wrong being made in a way that followed every procedural step correctly. The process worked. The outcome was catastrophic. That gap between process and judgment is the real subject of this episode. 12 hours later, they launched. January 28, 1986. Challenger launched from Kennedy Space Center at 11:38 a.m. Eastern. Temperature at the pad, 36 degrees, 15 degrees colder than any previous shuttle flight. Within the first second of ignition, hot gas penetrated the aft field joint of the right solid rocket booster. Puffs of dark smoke escaped the joint area on the launch film. The primary O-ring had failed. The secondary, hardened by cold, had not seated in time. For roughly a minute, aluminum oxides from the burning fuel temporarily plugged the breach. The vehicle climbed. Telemetry read normal. Around 58 to 59 seconds, the leak became visibly evident again as flame. Wind shear and vehicle loads may have magnified or reinitiated the breach. Flame reached the external tank. At 73 seconds, the tank ruptured. The vehicle broke apart. All 7 crew members were killed. The visible failure lasted seconds. The invisible one had been accumulating for years. What came next was the question every institution dreads. How did we let this happen? President Reagan appointed a presidential commission, chaired by William Rogers. Among its members, the physicist Richard Feynman, whose independent investigation would become as well known as the official findings. The technical cause was straightforward. O-ring failure in the right booster's aft field joint. Hot gas escaped, reached the external tank. Structural failure, breakup. But the commission did not stop at the technical cause. Its report found that the decision to launch was flawed, not because data was missing, but because of how data moved through the organization. Engineers had raised O-ring concerns repeatedly, over years. Those concerns had been documented, discussed at multiple management levels, and at each level, softened. By the time they reached senior decision makers, they arrived framed not as unresolved safety problems, but as accepted conditions of flight. The report described a communication failure, not in the sense that people stopped talking, but in the sense that the structure filtered what got through and how it was weighted. The people who understood the risk most precisely had the least influence over the final call. The people who controlled the call had the least direct contact with the data. Feynman, in his appendix, put it in terms that have become a reference point for every discussion of institutional risk since. The system had developed an almost casual relationship with danger, lowering its standards, flight by flight, always pointing to the last success as proof the next flight was safe. 2 causes: a failed seal and a failed feedback loop. A system that could not hear its own warnings clearly enough to act on them. But here's the question that makes this episode more than a history lesson. Was any of this specific to NASA? Challenger is taught in engineering programs, business schools, and organizational behavior courses worldwide. Not because it was unique, because the pattern it revealed is common. Here it is, stripped to its essentials. Repeated near misses create false confidence. Every time a system survives a close call, perceived risk drops. The near miss gets counted as validation, not warning. Missing data gets mistaken for safety. No evidence of failure is not the same as evidence of no failure. But when the conditions that would produce failure haven't been tested, it is very easy to confuse the two. Schedule pressure quietly changes decision standards. No one announces the bar has been lowered. Instead, the bar for proving a concern is serious enough to stop operations rises, inch by inch, until only certainty of disaster justifies a pause. Institutions reward continuity over interruption. The person who keeps the line moving gets recognized. The person who stops it gets questioned. That asymmetry shapes what people are willing to say, and when. Anomalies become background noise. The first time something unexpected happens, it gets attention. The 5th time, a tracking number. The 10th time, it is just how the system works. These behaviors are not specific to aerospace. They appear in healthcare systems that miss early warnings, in financial institutions that normalize increasingly risky positions, in infrastructure programs that defer maintenance until something breaks. In any system where the cost of stopping is visible and immediate, and the cost of continuing is statistical and deferred. Challenger did not invent this pattern. It made it visible. Disasters rarely begin at the moment of impact. They begin when a system gets used to explaining away what it should have stopped to understand. Challenger was not one mistake. It was a long sequence of small accommodations, each one reasonable on its own, each one shifting the boundary of acceptable risk a little further, until the boundary was somewhere no one would have chosen if they had seen the whole distance at once. The explosion lasted seconds. The decision culture that produced it developed over years, and the pattern it followed, near miss as reassurance, silence as safety, schedule as priority, is not history. It is a present tense condition inside any organization that mistakes survival for proof. This is the part that usually gets compressed into one sentence. The failure was real. The cause chain was longer. Next time, another design failure. Another system that taught itself to ignore what it already knew.
Specificity and rank define the order, but fragile architecture can't hold water. It's a cascade of forgotten code. A heavy legacy begins to overload. A cascade of effect.